Welcome back to the Great Mind series, another installment into the depth of mind, metaphysics, and meaning. I'm thrilled to embark on this exploration alongside three brilliant minds. First, let's extend a warm welcome to Dr. Iain McGilchrist, a distinguished psychiatrist and author celebrated by his explorations of the divided brain. Through his groundbreaking research, Dr. McGilchrist sheds light on the profound impacts of hemispheric specializations on perceptions, culture, and society. Next, we are honored to introduce Professor Mark Solms, a pioneering neuroscientist and psychoanalyst who work at the intersections of neuroscience and psychoanalysis as unveil the neural underpinning of consciousness, emotions, and unconscious mind. Finally, we are delighted to welcome Professor Hyman Schipper, a distinguished philosopher and metaphysician. Dr. Schipper's extensive background brings a unique perspective to our discussion. His profound inquiry into metaphysics and existential philosophy, along with his pioneering research in oxidative stress, brain aging, and neurodegenerative disease, offer a rich tapestry of insight into the natures of reality, existence, and the quest for meaning. Let's get the exploration started and let pass the captaincy to Iain. Take over. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ivy, and it's wonderful to be here with my distinguished colleagues. You've asked me to begin, and I suppose that I will very, very briefly say something about hemisphere theory, simply because it is, in the end, relevant to what I will have to say, but I know that many people are familiar with it. Effectively, why it's important, I think, is that it centers on attention. Attention is a very remarkable phenomenon from a philosophical point of view, and I'm not sure that we totally understand it, in fact, because it is an aspect of consciousness. Only consciousness can attend. So this is an important element. I believe that attention is the way in which the world that we experience, the phenomenological world, comes into being. And it's a coming together of whatever it is that's in my mind, my consciousness, and the world that we conventionally think of as outside that consciousness. And I'm neither a naive realist in the sense that I believe that there just is stuff out there that is passively waiting for us to understand it, nor do I think by any means that we make it up. The fact is that it is, like everything, I argue, relational in nature. I, in fact, argue ultimately, but we don't necessarily need to discuss this evening, I argue that basically all reality is relational in nature, and that the relata are things that emerge from a web of relationships. They're not prior to the relationships. In any case, the hemisphere theory is one in which I suggest that for entirely straightforward evolutionary reasons, all living creatures need to pay attention to the world in two different ways at the same time. One is in order to get stuff, basically, to manipulate it, to get food, to pick things up, to build shelter, to make a nest, whatever it may be, but essentially to manipulate for utility our surroundings. And for this, you need a narrowly targeted, a very precise beam of attention to a detail so that you can swiftly catch hold of it and manipulate it. However, if that is the only attention that the creature pays, it will not survive, because it needs at the same time to maintain a much, much broader attention to the whole field of what is there to be experienced. And that attention needs to be quite different. It's not already committed to what it is it's going to find. It's open as to what it may find. It's broad rather than narrow beam. It's sustained rather than piecemeal, moving from one entity that one knows one wants to another one in order to quickly grab it. It has a vigilant, sustained, broad and open attention to the world. Now, this is not actually in any way revolutionary. It's entirely conventional neurology. It's also not revolutionary that how you attend to the world changes what it is that comes to attention. In other words, your attention both governs what and the nature of what it is that you find in the world. And putting these two together, what one finds is, and this is borne out by a mass going back 100 years at least and more, of empirical evidence from brain lesions or deficiency syndromes, strokes, tumors, injuries, and so forth, as well as from more recently experimental envisioning of the brain by various different techniques. And effectively, to sum it up very simply, much too simply and much too crudely, but you'll forgive me for being brief, I'm sure, the left hemisphere sees a world that is comparatively familiar. After all, that's what it's looking for, the things that it knows it wants. Comparatively certain. The bits are isolated, they're fixed, they're removed from their context, they are explicit in nature, they tend to be abstract representatives of a type, general in nature, and effectively inanimate. All that would take a very long time to explain and to show the evidence for, but fortunately I've done so at enormous length in writing, so I will pass over that. Meanwhile, the right hemisphere sees things in a different way. It sees them as comparatively new, as open as to what they might be, as flowing, not static and fixed, as connected rather than isolated or fragmented, as often implicit, and it's surprising how much of what matters to us as human beings is implicit and has to remain implicit. I believe that all the things that we ultimately value, such as beauty and the arts in general, poetry, music, the visual arts, religion, love, sex, and even things like narratives and myths, which help to explain and put together a picture for us of the world, need to function implicitly when they're made explicitly an awful lot, if not everything that matters, is actually lost. And this world is one in which things are always contextualized. The context changes everything, and it's one that is essentially animate in nature. In addition, there are a few more distinctions that follow from this. One is that the left hemisphere tends to see parts, where the right hemisphere sees the whole, or the gestalt. This is very evident in the case of the body, where body parts are seen by the left hemisphere, but the structure of the body is relatively missing, whereas the right hemisphere is the hemisphere that contains the body image, which is not just a visual image, but an image in every sensory modality. The left hemisphere sees the categorical and the quantitative more, whereas the right hemisphere recognizes unique cases and the qualitative. And most importantly, the left hemisphere sees a representation, a map, a theory, a diagram, where the right hemisphere sees the presence, the world that is mapped. It's not a fault in a map that it contains very little information compared with the world that it maps. It's a strength. But nonetheless, it's very important to distinguish between these things, because if you start thinking we actually live in the skeletally thin, the jejune world of an intellectual abstraction, you miss just about everything that signifies anything to a human being in a human life. Broadly speaking, and this is a huge generalization, but it's importantly largely true, the left hemisphere sees things in terms of mechanisms which are essentially linear in nature. They follow procedures that are known and familiar, and they're sequential, whereas the right hemisphere is aware of the existence of organisms where all these factors break down. And until very recently, although physics had abandoned the purely mechanical model of the universe at least 100 years ago or more, the biologists have carried on thinking in terms of mechanisms until very recently. So there was a great step forward before the Second World War in terms of sophisticating our understanding of biology. But then with the advent of molecular biology after the war, things became imaged as a kind of engineering. And but much more recently, in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a great deal of progress made by people such as Michael Levin at Tufts in understanding that organisms are essential to the way we think about the world. And I just comment here that Robert Rosen, a famous mathematician and biologist, suggests that, in fact, everything that exists is better seen in terms of organism than mechanism. Mechanism is a very special case at a microscopically small scale in which you can understand that something causes something else. And there's nothing wrong with that. Again, it's a very useful thing to know, but it doesn't mean that the whole is a mechanism. Also, these have different strategies in relation to the familiar. So, as V.S. Ramachandran says, the right hemisphere is the devil's advocate. It's the one that says, this might be what you think it's going to be, but it might not. And for this reason, it takes very slightly longer, it ponders more before making a decision, whereas the left hemisphere tends very much to be quick and dirty, and as a result jumps to a lot of conclusions that are not borne out. Between them, they produce a kind of balance, but they have different views of what it means to be familiar. I'm just going to very quickly, and then I'm going to ask others to come in. I'm just going to say something about the structure of my latest book, The Matter with Things, because I do think, again, that it's relevant. It falls into 3 parts, although physically in 2 volumes. In the first part, it is neuropsychiatry and neuropsychology. The second part is philosophy, and the third part is ontology. When I say philosophy, I really mean epistemology, the ways in which we know that anything could be the case. And what I'm at pains to point out in part 1 is that effectively the right hemisphere is more veridical. In other words, if you followed the promptings of the right hemisphere, you would be less often caught out by reality than you would if you followed the promptings of the left hemisphere. And the left hemisphere has been called, not only by me, but by at least 2 other neurologists, frankly delusional. In other words, it tends to be deceived about the nature of things. And I'm not just using that word in a sort of everyday façon de parler. I look at about 30 syndromes in which there are delusions and hallucinations. In other words, they produce psychotic symptoms in subjects. And in almost every case, the vast majority of these are dependent on something going wrong in the right hemisphere, not going wrong in the left hemisphere. And in that part of the book, I just go through the various ways in which we could hope to get the first take on what the world is like, not to evolve our thinking about it, but just to get the basic information about the world. And one obviously is through attention. And there's no question that the right hemisphere's attention is more important, more substantial than that of the left. The right hemisphere is also better at perception than the left hemisphere. It forms more reliable judgments on the basis of what it has attended to and perceived. I know these are big claims to make, but they're argued for at length. And please, by all means, go and read them and write to me if you think I've got this wrong. It also, the right hemisphere is better with not just emotional and social intelligence, which it certainly is, but there is evidence that it is actually more important in the end for IQ than the left hemisphere, for cognitive intelligence. And it is also better able to be flexible in putting its presumptive take on what it is attending to together with what comes to attention. So, in other words, it's more creative fundamentally. And that is, in essence, an aspect of how we are able to shift our take on the world and see, it's not actually what I thought, it's something else. So the upshot of that is that the way in which the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere tend to the world produces reliably different phenomena that we can predict. And I've mentioned very briefly an outline of what those differences were. And we can also say that the ones that have the stamp of the left hemisphere about them are not dismissible. They may be very important, but they're less likely overall to lead us towards truth than those of the right hemisphere. So that gives us a new tool in philosophy. Until now, we've just had to say, well, some people think this, other people think that. Take your pick. But actually, we can also say, but this has a clear stamp of the left hemisphere about it. And its take on things is simply less veridical. The second part of the book is epistemology. And I take it that we would all agree that science and reason are extraordinarily important paths for achieving an understanding of the nature of the world. I also consider that intuition is very important, and imagination. In fact, imagination may be of ultimate importance. And by imagination, I do not mean fantasy. I mean something that is really the opposite of fantasy. Fantasy takes you away from reality. But as Schelling and Coleridge and Wordsworth pointed out, imagination is how you enter into the nature of something so that you can understand it for the first time. And in all these cases, a part is played by the right hemisphere and a part by the left hemisphere. But interestingly, even in the case of science and mathematics, there were a lot of very, if you like, humdrum procedural work needs to be carried out by the left hemisphere's processes of analyzing a situation in order to try and understand it better. The moment of understanding where a new gestalt falls into place and a new theory in science or mathematics comes into being is very strongly tied to what is known as the aha phenomenon, in which there's a shift in perception. And this is very clearly aligned with activity in the right superior temporal sulcus and gyrus and in the right amygdala. And in the last part of the book, ontology, I'm really looking at when we've looked at these things, what can we say with any degree of conviction about the nature of the universe? And I deal with a number of things, the coincidence of opposites, the one and the many, the nature of time, space, matter and consciousness. And then, perhaps to some people's surprise, I also talk about values, purpose, and the sense of the sacred, which I think are aspects of being that are not simply created by us, although the way in which they come into being for us is obviously modulated through the individual person who's appreciating those things. In relation to consciousness, I suggest that it is incoherent to suppose that consciousness can arise out of matter. Much touted has been complexity as a way, although even with complexity, there's a sort of now a miracle happens moment, because complexity on its own doesn't seem to explain why something should change its nature so radically that instead of simply being, as it were, external, it has an internal being. But also we know from interesting cases, some of which, of course, Professor Solms knows very well and describes, that people with hydranencephaly who have almost no cortex whatever are still capable of consciousness despite missing the vast complexity of the cerebrum. And of course the cerebellum, the ancient brain, that we used to think was just to do with things like coordination and motion, but now turns out to be involved in just about everything, it has 4 times as many neurons as the cerebrum, and these are highly complex neurons, not just very not under-resourced with terminals with which they can processors with which they can contact other neurons. But despite this fact, the cerebellum is incapable of consciousness on its own. So we come down to something that Professor Solms has come up with, which is that there is a place, and I think this entirely coincides with what I was taught in medical school, that effectively the reticular activating system in the brainstem is particularly important for consciousness. And Professor Solms says that there is a part of the midbrain that is only 2 cubic millimeters in size, which can abolish consciousness if destroyed or disturbed. Now that is extraordinarily interesting, and I admired very much the way in which you address the soft problem in your book, The Hidden Spring. But I don't know whether you'll disagree with me, but I didn't feel that you had yet, and there's no shame in that. After all, which of us has really got an answer to how, if you really expect consciousness to pop out of a lump of matter like the brain, how it does that, and the 2 cubic millimeters actually points up the miracle that you have illuminated. So instead, I believe that consciousness is the basis of everything. Matter is something we experience in consciousness. We have no knowledge of matter as such. It's just an aspect that we take on the temporal phase, but another way in which it can manifest that is as different from ordinary consciousness as we look at it when we think about it, as ice is from water or from the tons of water that is disseminated in the rooms in which we're all sitting and speaking, and if it wasn't there, we wouldn't be able to live. So I've set forward some thoughts there just to get the conversation going, and I'm very happy to go anywhere that anybody wants to, and look forward to whatever it is you will have to say.
Can I begin with a question, perhaps, based on with some of your remarks in you prefaced your comments by focusing on attention, suggesting that in your mind, attention is the closest thing we have neurobiologically to the notion of consciousness. But my question is based on Mark's writing, that affect and feeling are the closest things that I was able to glean from Mark's book as being tantamount to consciousness. So, Iain, do you think you can have attention without consciousness, or consciousness without attention? Because I do agree with Mark's notion, which I found very compelling, that you can't really have consciousness without feeling. It's almost by definition. And I'm wondering if attention also fulfills those kind of criteria for you.
Oh, absolutely. And when I mentioned attention, it was because I was going to describe the differences in the hemispheres, which do obviously relate to attention, not just to feeling, when both hemispheres clearly are capable of. But what I wanted to point up is the way in which attention changes the nature of the world. And that seems to be pretty important if we're talking about the relationship between our consciousness and the world. I accept entirely that you can't have consciousness without feeling, and that you can't have feeling without, I have to be careful here, without what we normally think of as waking consciousness, because there are obviously other modes of consciousness in which we know that sensation is certainly possible. Going from dreaming into coma, so all of that. But what I'm not sure about is that you can replace consciousness by the word feeling. There are states which one can achieve, or maybe thrust upon one, in which feeling is not, except very marginally, an aspect of what one is really experiencing. So I accept that feeling and consciousness is very important as a pairing, and it makes a great change from 20, 30 years ago, when pretty much neuroscience was rigorously attending to cognition. But at last, it seems to have cottoned on to the importance, which I don't do in any way want to diminish, of feeling.
Thanks, Hyman, for getting past these titles, and we're calling each other by our first names. What Iain said about the differences between the right and left cerebral hemispheres, all of it is absolutely correct, and I'm actually astounded by how correct it is, because after all, Iain is a psychiatrist, and he's not a neurologist. So people who work with these patients, like myself, I mean, not only can I confirm everything that you said from the literature, but from my own clinical experience, and also the fact that the way that you conceptualize the distinctive functional specializations of the hemispheres goes so far beyond the normal focus on purely cognitive mechanisms. Although I agree with Hyman, it's not fundamentally about attention. I'll come back to that in a moment. Let me remind you that in the cognitive neuroscience literature, all that they focus on is this sort of thing. And the right hemisphere syndrome, so rich in its phenomenology, and especially in its emotional and personality change phenomenology, it's all just, entirely ignored, because if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. So Iain's description of the differences is entirely up to speed and beyond, what my field has cottoned on to. And then Iain takes it beyond the mere neurology or neuropsychology and links these differences with many of the major problems of our time. And I think that too is a splendid contribution, and much to be welcomed, because what is, interesting about the brain is that it's us. And so it's obviously relevant to everything else, that's going on. So I hope that you understand, Iain. Hyman, you might understand my nomenclature but Iain might not. I hope you know I'm not schmoozing you when I say what I've just said. I really mean it. I also agree with what Hyman said, that ultimately what the cerebral hemispheres are doing is not the beginning and end of the brain, that it's in the service of deeper forces. And you yourself acknowledge that, Iain, that, it's, for example, what you attend to is what matters to you. In other words, it has to do with affect, it has to do with motivation. To use your earlier felicitous title of your earlier book, The Master and His Emissary, the master is the brainstem. The master is these arousal, these affective, motivating, driving forces, and then the cognitive cortex does what it can and must in the service of our organismic needs. So I'm sure that our conversation, as long as it lasts, will go deeper into all of these things. But I want to end my first intervention by touching on something that you said toward the end, Iain, and which I know from what I know of Hyman's work, will interest him greatly. It's got to do with this problem of the miracle, of sentient being somehow popping out of 2 cubic millimeters of brainstem. And so I want to say, as much as it might surprise or even disappoint some of our viewers, that I am not a materialist. I'm a neuroscientist, but I'm not a materialist. I think it's a big mistake to think that anything, any subjective experience is produced by any physiological processes of anatomical tissues. That's as if the subjective being of the mind is something like the bile that's produced by the liver. I think that's an entirely wrong-headed view. My own view is that of a dual aspect monist. I'm on Baruch Spinoza's side, that we have 2 different observational perspectives upon the essence of being. The one is looking at it from the third person external perspective. You see anatomy and bodily things, material things. But if you look at it from the perspective of being the organism or being ourselves, we have a different perspective, which is subjective experience, and it's every bit as real as the external perspective. So for me, the interesting thing is, what can we infer from both of these perspectives? Remember, the second perspective has been neglected, sorely neglected by neuroscience. So, what can we learn from the perspective of observing this part of nature from the outside? And then what can we learn from observing this part of nature from the inside? And then we have to draw inferences about something more fundamental, which we used to call the soul. It's neither material nor merely our experience. It's something far more fundamental. And I think that that's my way of thinking about these problems. It's not a materialist take at all. So over to you, Hyman. Perhaps you want to say something about that.
At the outset, I would say I agree fully that I think the view of all three of us, if I can be so presumptuous, is that there's more to reality than the material world, which puts us at odds with mainstream neuroscience, which has done a wonderful job in the last few hundred years expunging the soul and all things immaterial from science. You brought up Baruch Spinoza, Mark, and where I somewhat deviate from a Spinozan perspective is the idea of I subscribe strongly to the notion of panentheism. Panentheism being the idea that there is a deity that is both transcendent of the creation as well as immanent within the creation. My understanding of Spinoza is that he is a pantheist, not a panentheist, in that he believed that there is such a thing as a deity, but it's completely, this deity ensconced within the material world, to the point where if you understood everything there is to know about nature, you would know God fully. And that is not, well, from my perspective, Orthodox Judaism, that is an unacceptable view in Orthodox Judaism, where we, and I believe many Christians, probably Islam as well, adheres to this panentheistic notion. Why that might be relevant to consciousness, why I think it is relevant, is because imago Dei, we're made in God's image. And there is a passage from Job that says in Hebrew, "Mibsarai achazeh Eloka," which means, from my flesh I will know God, which means that there is a correlation between what's happening down in this very, very low material, mundane world with aspects of the deity that are expressed in much, much higher immaterial realms. Because we believe in a structure that's panentheistic, therefore the human mind, the human brain, should have an immanent component, which is within the functions of the central nervous system itself, but also an extracorporeal component that is linked to the transcendent nature of the deity, since we believe, the Kabbalah, for example, believes that everything in the totality is recapitulated in every one of its parts, which is like a hologram, which is like Bohmian mechanics. In fact, I got very excited by the conflation of the Kabbalah with contemporary science through the realization of how much of ancient Kabbalistic wisdom is being now expressed in the last 100 years or so through cutting-edge physics, especially quantum mechanics, Bohmian mechanics, and relativity. So why I think this is extremely important, not just for giving us insights into consciousness, which it definitely, I believe, does, but the sciences, as they're practiced by the mainstream, do not, as I mentioned, require a soul, do not require ethics. So you can be a fantastic neuroscientist without any development of your ethical character. We've seen examples of this in history, in recent history, how nations even that can be profoundly at the forefront of science can have abysmal ethics. We've seen this. We know that this is true. But if you could show that there's a profound, intimate link between a system like the Kabbalah and other theological constructs, which are imbued with ethical and moral principles, if you can show that they are very much compatible with the way we think of the world through physics, then it becomes, in my way of looking at it, easier to incorporate a moral and ethical structure into your life as a neuroscientist, as a chemist, as a physicist, by conflating these seemingly independent realms. And I think we're able to do this more and more in the last 100 and so years since quantum mechanics has come on board. Just the idea that light is both particulate and waveform, two opposites. This is a paradox, but it's not the kind of paradox we used to consider, which were epistemic paradoxes that, if we were a little bit smarter, maybe we'd be able to resolve the paradox. But we're now being shown that there are ontic paradoxes, like the duality of light, where we just have to accept the fact that the fabric of reality is made of opposites. And I think Iain has mentioned on several of his writings how the right hemisphere is much better at holding on to paradoxes of this kind, whereas the left hemisphere gets very rapidly confused by such paradoxical notions. So basically, this is how I would relate to Mark's comments about Spinozan way of looking at things. I think we agree on much, in that there's much more than just a material world, but how we actually see the immaterial world relating to material world is something we could discuss and explore.
I mean, we came together, didn't we, Hyman, because of my interest not only in neurology but in the Kabbalah. And you know that I am also a panentheist, and that I think you're absolutely right that Spinoza was a pantheist, which I think is a very different thing. And I would just like to expand that idea a little to the idea of consciousness and matter. That I'm very sympathetic to what Mark says about being a dual aspect monist. In fact, I have described myself as that before now. And indeed, that's what I was really suggesting when I said that consciousness can manifest in different ways. One of them being matter, which brings two new elements into the picture. One is a degree of resistance, and the other is a degree of permanence. And that these are rather important to creation. And since the cosmos appears, if nothing else, to be creative, they are probably very important aspects of whatever the consciousness is that underwrites existence, at least as I believe, and I imagine Hyman does too. So consciousness and matter may have a relationship in which consciousness is not exhausted by matter, and matter is not exhausted by consciousness. They are like God and creation. They are not. They're not just exhausted by one another. So there's something left over in each case, which I think is important to hang on to. And that applies actually also to the world of neurology and psychiatry, because I, I confess to being a psychiatrist, but not without interest in neuroscience and neurology that have gone right through my training, my practice, and the research I've done. And in that world, I've tried to see the brain and the mind as having the important relationships, but they are aspects. Once again, neither of them exhaust the other, but they do come together, neurology and psychiatry. And it's amazing how much of psychiatry, if you get interesting patients, as I've tended to get referred to me, it turns out to be quite a lot of it neurological in nature. So I don't think we're far away on these things at all. But what do you think, and can I ask you, Mark, to speculate and just say, no, I can't speculate, I don't want to. But how would you speculate on, because I think you do say somewhere that, consciousness arose with the brain, and you're not sure it arose with the human brain. It may well have arisen with animal life. In fact, I think you do believe that. But at some point, it sort of came into being through a brain. And I just wonder what you think about that.
Yeah,
how it could be explained.
I'll gladly comment on that. I just want to, first of all, say something sort of prefatory to make sure that our viewers understand where I'm coming from, which I think is very close to where the two of you are coming from. Because it sounds very spooky if you don't spell it out. It's really nothing mysterious. I'm saying that if you observe with your external senses, you're going to see an organ, a physical thing, what your eyes can register, what your hands can palpate. It's a thing. But if you experience or perceive observe this very same thing from the point of view of being that thing, what you experience is feelings and your own subjective being. So these are just two different ways of looking upon the same thing, which raises the question. Well, first of all, introduces the interesting fact that the thing is not what you're perceiving, because if you can perceive it in two such very different ways, it raises the question, well, then what is the thing that is manifesting in these two different ways? So it's not a matter of matter, we all know it's real, and then there's this other spooky stuff. I'm saying, no, we all know, that you can perceive the world within the modalities of your external sensory equipment. And we also all know we can experience ourselves subjectively, feelings and, and whatnot. These are empirical facts. We all know that they're true. But the fact that you can look at Mark Solms in the mirror and you can feel yourself to be Mark Solms with your eyes closed, it just shows these are not two different things. There's only one Mark Solms, and these are two different observational perspectives upon it. So the question is, what is the nature of that underlying reality? And it's profoundly important. I hope that what I've just said is eminently logical and sensible. I'm trying to make sure that everybody can see this is not something,
sure it is.
Not something crazy, that you have two different perspectives on yourself, the person you see in the mirror and the person you experience yourself to be. And they clearly are two perspectives on one and the same you. So what are you actually made of? And so when we say, or let me speak only for myself, when I say I'm not a materialist, is I'm saying I don't believe that my physical realization is me. I think that's just a way of perceiving me, a way of registering me. And I'm interested in knowing, well, what lies behind that? What lies behind that is not experience. There's two types of experience. What lies behind that is something profoundly unexperienceable. And that's why I'm interested in the sorts of things that you're saying, Iain, and the sorts of things you're saying, Hyman. And I'm speaking to you from Kathmandu, where people here have other ways of seeing
the group of Dalai Lama.
Yeah, but it's really so I am all for us getting over the arrogance of the present. These are things which for thousands of years people have pondered, and science for the most part has entirely ignored these mysteries. And I'm interested in incorporating these mysteries into science. And this is where I might deviate from what you were saying, Hyman. I recognize the mystery. I think we have to have much more humility in science than we do. And then it's a matter of the best I've got, is the scientific method, which is not scientific hubris or scientific, megalomania, which is, I'm afraid, what we're frequently faced with. It's a method. It's a way of systematically trying to reach the best guess that we can as to what it is that we really are. But what we really are is certainly not what we perceive ourselves to be. And I think to bring that problem into science is to do a great service to humanity and a great service to science.
Mark, I very much enjoyed in your example of the perception of lightning and thunder. You use that more than once in your book, that it's not that lightning gives rise. It's not causal to thunder. They're just two aspects of the same thing. And I think the third person perspective and the first person perspective are similar. That's dual aspect monism at play here to some extent.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'm saying is that I don't know whether Spinoza got it exactly right. When Spinoza's idea that whether there is a deity that we should treat as a person, as a subject, or whether there's a deity which is just the thing that we don't perceive, that we have to infer, which caused all of us and caused everything, rather than personifying it. I don't know. But I think that this is the sort of question, if we want to have a serious understanding of what being is, of what the mind is, I think that these are the sorts of questions we should be probing. But I don't want to claim at this point, I know it's like this, or I know it's like that. That frankly is the problem with philosophy and with religion, is claiming truth. Science pretends it doesn't, but it's doing the same thing. I think we just need a bit more humility, and I like the idea of we have a system, a way of testing our predictions against the evidence, and slowly recognizing it's going to be darn slow, and we probably will never get there. But at least we will be less deluded, to refer back to what Iain was talking about in terms of right hemisphere patients.
I mean, first of all, on truth, just very briefly, there are different kinds of truth. There's truth that one can only know from the inside, from experience, and there's truth that can be proved by equations. They are, in my view, different kinds of truth. One is truth as correctness. The other is truth as an unconcealing of something that is a gradual process. You don't claim you have the truth, but you're getting towards the truth. But what I really wanted to say is, before we go anywhere else, your description of the outside view and the inside view seems to me simply to assume the very thing I'm asking you to clarify for us. Because the experience, you keep talking about experience, but experience is consciousness. Without consciousness, there's no experience. Experience is another word for consciousness. And we can, of course, adopt different attitudes, pay attention in different ways, and therefore produce different realities. But you've moved nowhere, it seems to me, by saying that you can inhabit an interior perspective, because that's the very question I'm asking you. How does that come about from those 2 cubic millimeters of tissue? I wrote down something you say: how can a mere information processing system have feelings? Bloody good question. And your answer to this seems to be to invite us to abandon the third person objective perspective and replace it with an interior first person one. And then you say, now can you see? But in a way, you've just asked me to assume that the very thing that we're trying to get at is there, that this system has an interiority. How does that come about?
Sorry, I realize that I wasn't clear, and that's because I actually lost track of your question as one does, one follows one's own train of thought, and I'd forgotten where I was trying to get to. So let me begin again by saying, first of all, matter is also experience. That matter is not a fundamental property of the universe. Even in physics nowadays, it's no longer considered to be a fundamental property of the natural world. It is a way in which energy manifests itself. So, E equals mc squared, that's Einstein's insight. It's a very old insight.
Yes.
That energy can be converted into matter and vice versa. Matter and the material world is a way in which things manifest themselves to us. It's not a fundamental property. So I'm speaking about two different appearances. In other words, two different types of consciousness. The one is a subjective, inward-looking being of the organism, and the other is the external, outward-looking, observing from the outside of the organism. That's the matter. They're both just perceptions. But I'm not an idealist. I'm saying that I believe that these are perceptions of something. They're not just perceptions floating, in the ether. So the question becomes, what is that thing? Now, you said to me, why do I say you have to have a brain? I'm saying, well, that thing that I'm talking about from the outside looks like a brain. There's a certain point at which it becomes possible to experience both inwardly and outwardly. And it seems as if brains are necessary for doing that. Looked at from the outside, you could say being a subjective experiencing is necessary for doing that from the inside. Duh, yeah, of course. So these things correlate with each other. So I'm not saying the brain produces the experience. I'm saying the brain is the way you experience this development in nature from the outside, and the being is how you experience this development in nature from the inside. Coming back to my framework, I'm saying now we need to know, what is that development? What is it that happened? There is where we need to have humility again. So my own attempt at solving that problem is far from being the final word, and far from being something that even I find entirely convincing. It's just my best guess, given everything that we know so far. It seems to me that there's a certain sort of arrangement, of the fundamental things that constitute reality as best we understand it in physics today, which makes for an entity which is trying to continue to exist. It's not just a dissipative entropic cloud. It's a thing that's trying to maintain its own existence, bounding itself, and using certain sorts of operations to continue to exist. That we see through way down in physics, from the first sort of crystalline structures that try to maintain their form in the face of entropic forces. And I extend from that, to what kind of thing are we? We are something that opposes ceasing to exist, and that loses. In the end, we do cease to exist. So I'm trying to understand what the physics is, using the best tools we have today, which are not, please God, going to be the best tools we have in the future, trying to understand what sort of organization lies behind both of these appearances. I don't think that organization applies to everything, which is why, unlike you, Hyman, and I'm not sure of your view on this, Iain, I'm not a panpsychist. I don't think that everything has an awareness of existing. I think there's a certain point at which awareness of existing comes into being, a dawn of consciousness. And at that point, things have a being, but that's also only at that point that they can observe things as things. In other words, matter comes into existence at the same time. Matter as we know it, as we naively describe it.
First, again, I have to say I tremendously enjoyed your book, by the way, Mark. I learned a tremendous amount from it. The question I have is based on Iain's last comment and also what you were just explaining. How do you see, Mark, your model softening Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness? There's still in my mind a little bit
question.
A disconnect between Chalmers' hard problem and, Mark, your thesis in the book. How do you see it softening the heart?
To begin with, I think that I have given us a clue as to how we might begin to solve the hard problem. I'm not claiming to have solved the hard problem. There are two ways in which I tackle that problem. The one is the very thing we've spoken about over the last several minutes, which is that Chalmers's hard problem starts from the assumption that the matter has to produce the experience. And I'm saying, no, these are two different types of experience of one underlying thing. So the thing that is causal is something that causes them both. The hard problem is, how on earth does my experience, subjective qualia, arise from the firing of neurons?
Exactly.
I'm saying that it doesn't.
Yes.
These are two different ways of seeing one thing. So the problem is misconstrued in my view, because it assumes a sort of a dualism that I don't think exists. It's a dual aspect monism. The second way in which I try to tackle Chalmers is that he uses as his model example perceptual, well, actually vision. How are we to explain, the fact that you don't need to experience vision in order to have vision. Vision can carry on unconsciously. You can do all of this visual stuff unconsciously. Our mechanistic accounts of how vision works doesn't require the adding of qualia of what it is like to see. You can explain all the mechanisms on that famous Frank Jackson thing about Mary, the visual neuroscientist. You can explain all the mechanisms of vision without it being necessary for there being anything it's like to see. And he's right. It's true. Most of our perceptual processes go on unconsciously. Extremely complex, uniquely human processes like reading with comprehension go on unconsciously. So I think it's a valid question. Why do you need to add the experience? The mechanistic account of vision doesn't account for experience. And I'm saying that's because you're looking at the wrong model function. We shouldn't look to vision precisely because it's not an intrinsically conscious function. We should be looking to feeling because feeling is intrinsically conscious. You can't have a feeling without feeling it. And so that's the second way in which I try to tackle his hard problem, is saying, well, if we look at it in terms of a function, you can't explain how feeling works without explaining why you have to experience it. So what does the feeling do? It has to be built into your mechanistic account of this function that we call feeling. So that's the sort of main. My book is not philosophical. The dual aspect monist thing I just take for granted. But the looking at the science of affect brings us to the sort of thing I was alluding to briefly a few minutes ago, that an organism that is trying to, or a system that is trying to continue to exist, has an intrinsic valence. There's a goodness and badness. It's bad if I'm going to dissipate. It's good if I continue to cohere and exist. It has an intrinsic subjectivity. It has a point of view. It's only good for the system. It's not good in any kind of general objective sense that Mark Solms continues to exist, but it's good for Mark Solms, So there's a subjective, intrinsically valenced, and then the qualitative aspect is that there are multiple dimensions to such a system. It's not just one thing about survival and death. There are multiple factors that need to be attended to if you're going to survive. You need to drink and eat and sleep, etc. And each of these things is categorically different. You can't say 8 out of 10 of sleepiness and 8 out of 10 of thirst makes 16 out of 20 of need, and all I need to do is sleep. If you don't drink as well, you'll die. So these are categorical needs. They are intrinsically qualitative. The categorical variables are qualitatively different. 8 out of 10 of sleepiness is not the same thing as 8 out of 10 of thirst.
But
so I'm saying mechanistically, these are the kinds of mechanisms that account for an entity that has values, that has subjectivity, that has feeling, and that's the best I can do.
There's so many things being raised here that need to be addressed, I feel.
Yes.
So, first of all, not all experience is feeling. Not all qualia are feelings. So when you see something, there is such a thing as the color of red. And so there is an interior aspect, just as there is to feeling, to perception, in the sense that we cannot account for the qualia any other way. That's, I think, a point worth making, because if you restrict so much what interiority of experience is, you're beginning to erode the size of the problem. The second thing I'd say is, if you're prepared to say, and I think you're entirely right, I'm not a physicist, but this is what physicists tell me, that matter and energy are interchangeable, of course, E equals mc squared, that matter is a form of energy. Energy doesn't in itself explain interiority, the first person perspective. This is the key thing that is not addressed. So why would you not, or would you perhaps accept the idea that the interchangeability is between, or not even interchangeability, but that consciousness is the root thing here that brings in the first person perspective, and that matter is a way in which consciousness manifests, and we're privy to that consciousness, and we see things that we call material in it. So instead of having energy as the root thing that interchanges with matter, how about having consciousness as the root element that interchanges with matter? And the third thing I just want to say, because you've raised so many things, is you talk about how, and you in your book you say a lot about this, about how we want to persist in existence. That's absolutely true. And you say also that crystals want to kick against the direction of entropy and manifest and continue to manifest themselves. Where does this desire for persistence come from? And what is that? What drive is that? How do you explain that? I say it's because the cosmos is conscious and creative, and that it actually is looking to make certain things that will persist for a while. It doesn't want to persist for too long, because after all, the thing has got to evolve all the time. But these things go unexplained, I think, in the picture that you're painting. And I think they're worth addressing if you feel the same as I do.
Yes, so Hyman, forgive me, I don't want to have a ping pong thing with Iain, but I'll be ever so brief and then hand over to you. The first point, I do not believe that all consciousness is affect. I'm saying that all consciousness is predicated upon affect. And I've, in my book, expelled out all the empirical reasons for saying that there is no such thing as any kind of consciousness without reticular activating arousal. And reticular activating arousal, I've showed by various methods, is affect. So first you have to have feeling. And the way I think of it is, I feel like this, and then becomes the question about that. So this is the affect, is feeling your way into your perceptions and cognitions, and they are fundamentally unconscious, but are rendered conscious because they matter to you. There's a common currency between the feelings, which are the questions, the demands on the mind for work, and the attempts at answers, the work that cognition performs. Then you have a different meaning of the word feeling. You feel your way into your perceptions and cognitions. They're no longer affective. They are responses to the affective demand. And I fully agree that they are qualitatively different because they are different types of things. But you cannot have a cognitive consciousness without it being modulated and aroused from the brainstem. It's just absolutely demonstrably the case. So it's not that all consciousness is feeling, it's that no consciousness is possible without feeling of the affective kind, and then it demands this other kind of consciousness, which is an uncertainty about your perceptions. So the uncertainty is the common denominator. The felt uncertainty is the thing that explains all of that. Now, I won't go into any more detail because, as I said, I don't want to just have a ping pong about this, but I'm just going to indicate the direction in which my thinking goes. The second thing about, well, why can't it be consciousness to begin with? It could be. This is what I mean by having to have an open mind about these things. It really could be. I'm open to the possibility. I mean, I think you mentioned Mike Levin earlier in the conversation. I had my work cut out for me when I had to persuade, or tried to persuade, my neuroscientific colleagues that the cortex is not the seat of consciousness, and that all vertebrates, as long as they have the brainstem architecture I've just been speaking about, must be conscious, and all the evidence suggests they are. And then Mike Levin takes us way down below vertebrates, and I just thought, oh my God, his arguments are convincing, and now my job is even harder. So I no longer think it's only vertebrates. It goes a hell of a lot further down. How far down, I honestly don't know. Is it possible that it's possible, but my feeling is a crystal, to give an example, and even more basic than that, just like an ordinary sandstone rock or something, it's maintaining its structural integrity is entirely monotonous. I mean, there's no dynamic going on there. It's just the same thing over and over again. To quote the Talking Heads song, heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. For a rock, nothing ever happens. So we're a much more complex dynamical system with much more itinerant strategies as to how we're much more palpating of uncertainty and trying out of different things. And I think consciousness, for reasons I only alluded to earlier, has more to do with that feeling my way through novel problems. Once I've got a solution that I just repeat over and over again, then just as in the human brain, it no longer has consciousness. So I'm basing my thinking on, what we know about consciousness suggests to me that there are things which are not, or which are so teeny weeny little bit consciousness that it's sort of like barely deserves the term. But I think it's a continuum. I'm not a fundamentalist on this point. Your third point I've forgotten, but maybe it's just as well. Let's give Hyman a chance to speak.
It was just about direction.
Which direction?
Yes, purpose, direction, drive.
Yes, so the drive is the drive to persist, and you're saying, why doesn't everything have that?
No, I didn't say that. I was
sorry. I'm sorry, I'm not registering it properly. So let's hear
what
it's fine.
We'll bring Hyman in. It doesn't matter. It's just that in your system, you rightly point out how important this drive which is expensive in terms of energy, and ultimately ends up with incredibly expensive things like us. Where does this drive to do all this come from? As Ian Whitehead said, the great secret of persisting is never to have been alive. It's much more effective. When you're alive,
I am going to address that now that it's come back to me. Look, the first answer is I agree that that's a great mystery. Where does this tendency toward order come from? I think it's fantastically interesting. That certain processes organize and others do not, and that organizing tendency goes against a far bigger disorganizing tendency. So the second law of thermodynamics is a disorganizing tendency, and yet some things go against it. So William Ross Ashby long ago observed that it just is a naturally occurring thing, that the self-organizing systems just come about. And I think it's fantastically interesting that they do. I think that we are such organisms, we are such systems, we are self-organizing. And not all things are self-organizing. Why it happens, it just seems to be, like, why did the universe come into existence? It just does. This is how things work. So, I agree. It's a profoundly interesting, wonderful thing that organization occurs in the overarching vastness of disorganization. But I think that's where the purpose lies in those systems which seek to persist. That's what I call drive. I and many others call drive, which I think is the fundamentalist trying to exist within certain viable bounds, and this is where prediction comes from. That I expect to be in this sort of state, not in any old state, and I'm trying to be in my expected states. The energy in question, therefore, is what Friston calls variational free energy. In other words, I want to reduce the difference between what I expected would happen and what actually happened, which is not what I expected would happen. That's bad for my continued existence. That's free energy is average error, average unexpectedness. And you're trying to minimize that. It's an informational energy that I think we're talking about. Which, by the way, is also perfectly fine nowadays in physics. Everybody in physics accepts that information is a fundamental energy and that information is physical. Physical in the sense not of material, but in the sense of physics. In other words, the fundamental forces that explain everything. Hyman, I'm so sorry, I'm jabbering on. At last.
Not at all. I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated by this discussion. So I do have two questions, one very focused and another one a little bit more broad. And the focused question is, in your book, you mention or you show an example of the hydrancephalic child. And when you put her baby brother, there's what appears to be an emotional reaction. And you sort of imply that that's proof of feeling without a cortex. My question is, why can't you interpret that the way you interpret patients that have ALS or multiple sclerosis that have what's called a pseudobulbar palsy? They have a deafferentation of part of the brainstem, and they can start crying pathologically, but when you ask them, are you sad? They say no. It's just almost like a reflex outburst of Pape circuit, for example, or something of that nature. So how could you, isn't it possible that child, that hydrancephalic child showing facial expression, there may the light's on, but nobody's home. Is it still possible there is no feeling in that, just judging from other neurological conditions where you have pseudobulbar palsy? That's one question. Maybe I'll let you, respond to that.
Yes. As you saw earlier, I'm old and I lose my working memory. It's best to ask me one question at a time. So just to be sure that our viewers know what Hyman's talking about, hydranencephalic children are children born with no cortex. And the instance that Hyman's referring to is an instance I showed of a hydranencephalic child with no cortex. You place her baby brother on her lap and she goes, she likes it. And you tickle her, she laughs, and you take her baby brother away, she protests. You prick her with a pin, she winces and withdraws. She shows all sorts of basic emotions in inappropriate situations. Now, Hyman's saying, how do we know those aren't just reflexes with no feeling attached? And it's a perfectly reasonable question. Because, as he says, we know about, for example, pseudobulbar pathological laughter and crying, where stereotype motor reflexes are triggered in the brainstem with no appropriate cause, because these are pathological cases, and the patient will tell you, I'm laughing, but I'm not feeling any mirth, or I'm crying, but I'm not feeling any sadness. So it's certainly possible, and I'll tell you why. I'll give you two sets of reasons why I don't think it's probable. The one is that I have examined many a patient with these phenomena that you're referring to, these pseudobulbar phenomena. It's nothing like these kids. It's amazing how many people who raise this deeply skeptical philosophical argument about how do you know? Perhaps it's just a reflex. They've never even interacted with one such child. When you interact with these children, unlike interacting with patients who show, for example, pathological laughter and crying, it's nothing like it. It's entirely situationally appropriate. You give this sort of stimulus, they respond exactly as you would expect. You give that one, they respond as you would expect then. And the whole feeling of the relationship between you and the child, it's just, it's like between you and your dog, or your cat. You just know that there's somebody home. We're interacting with each other, and it's nothing like with those patients where it's really weird. It's like, why is this guy crying? He doesn't. There's no reason to, and he doesn't even seem to be sad, and he even tells me he's not. So that's the first thing, is that the phenomenology. Anybody who's interacted with these children, and read the people who have, they all describe this astonished. None of us expected it. We were everything. I mean, I also was taught that the cortex is necessary for consciousness. I believed it. Why would I disbelieve all my professors? Then you interact with these children, and you see, my God, this is just not what the theory predicts. Not at all. But the other reason is because I grant that these children can't speak, just like our Labradors and kitties can't speak, and our pre-verbal infants can't speak. So, maybe they're zombies. Maybe, I don't think it's likely, but, it's possible, because they can't tell us, yes, I feel pain, or yes, I'm glad my brother was placed in my lap and I like it. So therefore we use other methods. So I say, oh, right, well, let's take somebody who's got cortex and stimulate those brainstem structures. My prediction is they will feel intense emotions. That's exactly what they do. They show profound emotionality. I mean, I reported in my book one patient who fell into a suicidal depression within 5 seconds of stimulating the reticular activating. So there's no psychiatric history at all. And that's just one example. They're all, you show intense emotions and the widest range of emotions, stimulating those structures. And they can speak, and they say, don't know where that came from, but I have this very intense feeling. Then you image them with positron emission tomography, which is the appropriate imaging method for emotions. And you see they're in an intensely emotional state. You see the activation is in the brainstem. So, there again, these are people who can tell you, I feel frightened, fear, terrified. And then you look, where is the brain activation? It's not in the cortex. It's in these deep subcortical structures. And then you take pharmacological probes. You psychiatrists should know, the mainstream psychiatric drugs act on the modulators that are sourced in the reticular activating system, dopamine, the serotonin, noradrenaline, and why should manipulating the chemistries that mediate these circuits change the emotional state of the patient if it wasn't that these are emotional systems? So it's the converging evidence that persuades me, makes it probable that those kids are feeling. It's possible they're not, but the weight of the evidence to me just suggests otherwise.
The question is more engaging Mark in a thought experiment. If I understood his book well, we aspire to minimize unpredictability. That's our goal in our survival strategy. The more you can do that, the more is relegated to automaticity, like the cerebellum doing things at the driving a car that you don't even have to think about each movement. But the more you have automaticity, the less consciousness is required or manifest. So my thought experiment is, if we evolved as a species where our predictability would be so much enhanced in the future, would we become unconscious? Because no longer necessary.
We have to be careful about what we wish for. That's why I quoted that line from the Talking Heads. Heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. But the fact of the matter is the universe is such an unpredictable place, and our needs are so multifarious and conflict with each other and so on, that ideal state will never happen. But yes, that is what I believe, that the design principle is we're trying to be less conscious. But I need to just add one little footnote, that we have multiple drives, but one of them is the seeking drive. So where it needs to be is engaging with uncertainty. So its homeostatic set point is engaging with novelty. So that adds a further wrinkle to the story. But now I really will. Let's go over to the audience.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly carry back on that. When you say less consciousness, I have to disagree from my Buddhist perspective. I think when you minimize all that predictive error, you have a bigger option. You got a more intense epistemic openness. So I would say it would not be less conscious. You'll be into a samadhi kind of state. you would have the cyclical renewal of energy continue, never stop. So there is no point of something is disappear. No point of we left consciousness, nothing at all. We have this bigger, massive temporal reality that will become it when we minimize all this noise in our brain. When I'm in that kind of meditative state, yeah, my epistemic openness is bigger. My temporal space is bigger. My reality is bigger, but the noise is reduced. That's the differences of it. So
yeah, the seeking is an epistemic. It's an epistemophilic drive. That's the default drive. I agree with you.
Yeah.
No, well, I agree with Buddhism on that point.
Well, look, there's so much to say, but I mean, yes, I broadly agree with that idea of a universal consciousness, and I think our brains reduce our consciousness to the one that we have. But in answer to the idea of would we be better off unconscious, there's a distinction that has not been properly made throughout this conversation between consciousness as what one loses when one's anesthetized or dead, and consciousness as in what is in the focus of our consciousness, which I associate with the left hemisphere's attentional beam. And what is very clear, and this is another point brilliantly made by Whitehead, is that we are most efficient when we can rely on automatic procedures. It doesn't mean we become unconscious. It's just that we can't be focally aware of everything. So we shouldn't focus on those things. We do better when we don't. But consciousness can be brought in when there's a genuine problem that can't be solved by already learnt mechanisms. And he compares these incursions of consciousness to cavalry charges in battle. He was talking that long ago that they're expensive. They can only be done once or twice, and they require fresh horses. But a lot of the time, we're doing very, very well, ticking over automatically. But it doesn't mean we're unconscious. It means we're super intelligent. With our consciousness, we know when to forego conscious focus. There we go. But I think that we will become unconscious because there's no chance that AI will become conscious, but there's plenty of evidence that people are becoming more like machines with every passing day.
That was amazing. Listening to the two of you just recently mention, I think, the default mode network. There are also times where you're talking about attention, attending, drive, and arousal. And I was just wondering if you wanted to talk about a little bit about the default ascending arousal network. A lot of times people are focused in relaxation-based meditations. But there's also arousal-based meditations and practices that probably invigorate this arousal network. And I was just wondering if you wanted to talk about that.
I defer to my colleagues here. I mean, what I do know that's possibly worth reporting about meditation is that, generally speaking, we know that certainly mindfulness meditation leads to actual physical enlargement of certain areas in the right, not left hemisphere, which is interesting. And the experience of mindfulness phenomenologically is very much like the suppression of the critical, categorical, verbal part of our being to allow something simply to be there, not be already a representation as it is in the left hemisphere. So that doesn't surprise me at all. And in the book, I quote from a particular guru who's considered the world expert on mindfulness. And I quote a short paragraph and point out 23 things about it that align it with the phenomenology of the right hemisphere. But there is such a thing as blissful state meditation, which, as I understand it, gurus don't themselves greatly prize, although they recognize it exists. And this seems to be associated with hyperactivity in the left frontal region, which is not surprising because this is excited in mania and is likely, if not opposed, to lead to inappropriate elation. My suspicion is that it gets to be excited because one of the ways of suppressing the posterior part of the left hemisphere is by reactivating or activating to a greater extent the left frontal region, which acts in balance with the posterior cortex of its own hemisphere. That's all I would say about that.
I have to start with a disclaimer, which is to say that I am no expert on meditative practices in any way, let alone as a neuroscientist. I've done precisely one study, an fMRI study of mindfulness in bipolar disorder. And that's the totality of my scientific knowledge about it. So all I've been able to glean is that there are a great many different things that go under the heading of meditation, and one shouldn't reduce it all to one mechanism. But the person who was asking the question was specifically, if I heard it correctly, referring to the default mode, and that I do know something about. Incidentally, in our that one study that I did with the mindfulness intervention in these controls and bipolar patients, the changes that we saw were a reduction in convexity activation in favor of default mode, which is primarily midline activation, what we do know, what we've learned in very recent times, is, well, not so recent in terms of this. The default mode is anything but, nothing's happening. It's a very active state of mind. It's just not an externally directed state of mind. It's an internally directed state of mind. And secondly, this is the recent thing, is it's driven by mesocortical, mesolimbic dopamine. It's a dopaminergically activated state. In other words, it's a seeking of something. It's a sort of sifting through something internal, an exploration, if you will, of something internal rather than an externally focused, which ties with what Iain's saying, because the right hemisphere is this externally focused, and the left hemisphere is this kind of, laser beam on a. The default mode is not laser beaming on anything. It's just sort of, mulling over what's what. So I think it links that default mode network, I think, on the basis of recent evidence, links with what I was saying about the seeking system. It's just an internal foraging rather than an external one.
In recent time, I became quite interested in the default mode network, not so much in my own laboratory, but philosophically, because its activity seems to correlate with a sephirah called da'at. According to the Kabbalah, everything is made of 10 sephirot. And if you count them, there really are 11. And that's because the most sublime sephirah, Keter, is counted when da'at, which is like an internal brain, is not counted, and vice versa. When you count da'at, you leave out Keter. Keter is the part that interfaces with extracorporeality. And I find it very interesting that looking at about maybe 8 to 10 different disease states where I would predict, based on the Kabbalah, that there would be more Keter influence and less Da'at influence. In those conditions, I'm finding that the default mode network is suppressed where Da'at is suppressed. There's a very interesting correlation there that may have some implications for how these diseases work. Like, for example, in the case of schizophrenia, there is a decrease in the default mode network, possibly because the influence of Keter, which is stuff coming in from the outside, is overwhelming the vessel, the kli, the brain. Whereas in other diseases like Alzheimer's disease, there's a limitation on what might be coming in extracorporeally, and therefore there's an increased emphasis on some intrinsic brain mechanisms until they fail as well. I don't want to say more about this at this point. It's something that I'm going to hopefully publish soon. But the default mode network is something that seems to relate to certain Kabbalistic concepts.
And so epistemologically, I think most of us can agree that the past is real and that the past contains all of the evolution of life, whatever that was. And within that path that life took, the many paths that life took, amorphous and changing and intermingling, that it came together into what we now are. But we are a conglomeration of more than just some specific senses or specific brain networks. Our consciousness, our attention, is this conglomerate of all of these past developed. My question is, because I like to play with this, is the past real?
Referring to lower species, it is true that neurobiologists sometimes have to lean on simpler neural networks in order to understand some of the fundamental functions of the brain. So you look at nematode worms, you look at Drosophila flies, to try to, because the human brain is just far too complex for this. But this idea, this reductionist approach breaks down, I think, when you're talking about consciousness, because I intuitively believe I have a better idea of my human neighbor's consciousness than I do the consciousness of of an ant or a gecko or even a plant. So I think you cannot try to understand consciousness, as far as my way of looking at it, by looking at lower species, because we have absolutely no idea what goes on in the mind of these other species. So if you understand what I'm saying.
If you're, I do, but I think if you're thinking about your neighbor or your friend, that human miscommunication often comes because we completely don't know what someone else is talking about also. So that can also happen.
No,
we think we know what someone means, but we don't, right?
Yeah, no, but I think you can more easily infer the nature of consciousness in a friend or a relative or a neighbor than you can.
Totally.
Well, I think basically that's the point I wanted to make.
As you know, Ivy, I am at an animal consciousness conference at the moment. That's where I'm speaking to you from. And I've just learned a great deal from my colleagues that I myself didn't know. Colleagues working on insects, on spiders, on fishes, on birds. It's really the point that Hyman just made about animal consciousness. It's and secondly, they have lived. The other animals have lived through the very same evolutionary process that we have. So, your starting point about the evolutionary time and the complexity that is given rise to applies to all. Those species are not our ancestors. They are at the same point in time as us. And the second point that I wanted to make is that what you were saying about, the past is real, isn't it? I'll just want to allude to something because there's no time to go into this in depth. That yes, it's a very important distinction between the past and the future. The future is much more uncertain than the past. The past, I'm not saying we know everything about the past, but it's a lot more certain than the future. So the future is more entropic, the past is less so.
One way to think about the present is that it's on the surface of an expanding sphere, and that the past is what it leaves behind and contains, and the future is what it is moving into. And that sort of neatly, for me, explains the distinction to be made there. One is potential, but there's nothing unreal about potential. It's just less certain. So I completely agree about that. I just want to make a brief comment about intelligence. The way I understand intelligence, it needs consciousness. But then we are faced with the fact that, or not and we are faced with the fact that single cell organisms appear to exhibit intelligence. What do I mean here? That they react creatively in a novel way to a situation that they could not be prepared for by evolutionary history or by their own personal history. And they can do this quite quickly. And Barbara McClintock won a Nobel Prize for effectively demonstrating this. And James Shapiro at Chicago says that single cells are intelligent. Now, I don't necessarily, I share Hyman's view that I'm not quite sure what's going on, as it were, in there, but something is going on in there, and it seems unreasonably and irrationally dogmatic to say that they can't have some form of consciousness.
In the context of consciousness, my question is, how do we understand the consciousness in those patients? Uh, does it has any impact on the at the consciousness level, or the consciousness remains, there is no change in the consciousness per se, but only the effect is in the behavioral level? So how to understand that, how to understand the consciousness in those cases?
So he's asking about dissociative identity disorder and, you know, what the place of consciousness is in these various alter egos. I'll just say this because it's the only thing I know about it from my own personal work, is that it has everything to do with consciousness, in the sense that what is dissociated is different conscious states. In other words, different forms of episodic and semantic autobiographical memory. So it's your sense of who you are that's changed when you shift from one alter to the other. It has everything to do with the conscious forms of memory. The unconscious forms of memory, the declarative forms of memory. This is the only study I've done with these patients. We were able to show that their procedural memories and the other subcortical or non-conscious forms of memory, that there's a consistency. So if you have a skill or a habit, a procedure that you've habituated, like you know how to ride a bicycle or how to play the piano or how to swing a golf club, in all of your alters you can do that. So those unconscious memory systems are what is common to the all the alters, and what is split, what is dissociated, is the conscious memory systems. I'm not sure that's what you were asking about, but that's all I know about it.
I mean, clearly these states do refer to consciousness, because that's where they manifest themselves as different personalities with different characteristics. So clearly consciousness involved, but also the brain, as I'm sure you all know, is differentially active in different alter states. And one particularly interesting case is of a woman who had an alter who was blind. And when she was in the blind alter and looked at things, she couldn't see them, and there was no activity in her occipital cortex. But when the sighted alter came back, there was activity in the occipital cortex, which is where you would expect it. So I just throw that in. I'm not an expert.
You know, Bernardo Kastrup looks at human consciousness, individual human consciousness, as a dissociated state from a cosmic type consciousness in his idealistic understanding of reality. And he attributes the ability for us to cordon off our own consciousness from the surround, which the Kabbalah does also, through the, he gives the example of what a Markov blanket does. A Markov blanket is a mathematical structure that allows a microcosm to be embedded and function independently of the embedding matrix, without the microcosm being completely inundated by the surround. And he views each human consciousness, as does the Kabbalah in its own way, as having some sort of like a Markov blanket, separating it from the mind at large. He calls it mind at large. You might call it the mind of God, if you're looking at it theologically. So to take that a step further, it would seem to apply the same reasoning that the normal state of a human mind is to have a single consciousness, but for reasons of disease, there is a internal cordoning off of aspects of what gives of what the correlate of consciousness is in the brain, such that now there are Markov blankets separating the single consciousness into, let's say, 3, 4, or 7 individual consciousnesses. That's how I would construe what might be happening in that psychiatric condition, based on Kastrup's idealism and Kabbalistic panpsychism?
That's a philosophical implication there, isn't it? So meaning the self, it's fluid. It's not static. It's not fixed. You know, like Professor Solms, you believe in soul, because in Buddhism, there is no empirical evidence, observable evidence to say that something is immutable. Yeah, the concept of immutable self, it's quite incoherent, contradicting the empirical observations that the self, it's fluid, it's not static. So there is an implication of the questions he's asking. He's asking is basically the self is not epistemic. It's only on the supervene level, on our conventional or colloquial level, meaning in an ultimate level, there is no such a thing self. Yeah, that's the implication of the model as well. I want to add on. I hope you can understand. It's a very Eastern kind of thoughts. Yeah.
I'd want to just come back a little on that. I think there needs to be a distinction between the idea that the self grows, changes, and flows, as indeed Heraclitus said, everything does flow, and the idea that there is no coherent self. What happens in the case of pathology is that there is no coherent self. And it's not just dissociative disorders, but it's also in schizophrenia that there is often an absent sense of the coherent sense of the self. And of course, in borderline personality disorder, which is another basically dissociative condition. But these are not enviable conditions. These are not admirable conditions. And they tell us nothing about, as it were, the norm. And they tell us what can happen when things go wrong. And I wrote a piece called Selving and Union, which is about the topic that there's a difference between having an ego and having a self. And what I think the sages say is that the ego is discarded, but the self is never discarded and would in fact be a disaster if it were. Even the Buddha had to eat and drink, and it was he who ate and drank. When the Buddha died, it wasn't someone else that died, it was the Buddha that died.
As I keep on saying, because it's such an unusual fact, here I am in Nepal at the moment, and so I'm all of these things about Buddhism are all around me, and I'm puzzled. But I mean, I'm really, really naive about Buddhism. I'm learning as I go along. But today I did a tour through several monasteries. And, there are all sorts of contradictions in it. How can there be reincarnation if there's no self? I mean, what is reincarnated if it's not from a self from one incarnation to a self in another incarnation? So I agree with Iain. I think that the loss of self is not something we should aspire to. Knowing ourselves is something we should aspire to.
I hope nobody took me to be being critical of Buddhism, which I, like Mark, have only an imperfect understanding of, and which actually I very much admire.
Yes, while you're there, there are lineage holders in the region in which will be very profound to talk to. Working through this subject matter, it takes oftentimes many, many years of study and practice and experience to actually realize what is being talked about right now. But there is Shyalpa Tenzin Rinpoche in Nepal. He's the head of the peace sanctuary that's being built in Lumbini, and also has a monastery in Kathmandu or near Kathmandu.
Was there today?
He was there today.
Yep.
In Lumbini at the sanctuary. It's still building,
Wonderful.
right?
Oh.
Yeah, Rinpoche
Oh,
building.
fabulous.
I just want to say massive thank you to everybody involved and for Ivy for putting this together. I've been looking forward to this. I really appreciate I could see a lot of psychoanalysis coming into play in here, as well as everything from panpsychism to metaphysics to neuroscience. And I always enjoy the intersection of those things. I have a question kind of related to a previous one for the whole panel. I really struggle with pinning down in these types of conversations what exactly we mean by consciousness, especially when it starts getting into things like animism, panpsychism. An interesting statement you said of maybe the universe is, rather than an excitation of energy, an excitation reflection or a manifestation of consciousness. I'm curious if people would like to say definitively, maybe without proof, because this is very hard to prove and it is subjective, what do they think consciousness actually is when it comes to these conversations? And when it comes to the space of meanings, kind of a two-part question, do you think there is such a thing as objective meaning, or do you think meaning is entirely subjective? And thanks everyone for your responses.
I have a deflationary definition of consciousness because it is such a complex thing. I try to refer to what is fundamental to all forms of consciousness. When I'm trying to theorize about consciousness and do science about consciousness, I'm referring simply to Tom Nagel's definition of something it is like to be an organism, something it is like for the organism. That is a conscious organism. If there's something it is like to be it. Now, the question becomes, is there something it is like to be a rock? Is there something it is like to be a spider, an ant, us, a fish, etc.? So that's what I mean by consciousness when that's what I'm trying to understand. The question of meaning, sadly, it again requires, it depends what you mean by meaning. It's an equally complex term. So I would just say, of course, each person's meaning is their own. In that sense, it refers to the meaning for a particular meaning-seeking subject. But I think that the fact that we are all meaning-seeking subjects alludes to the fact that there is some objective thing that can be said about the overarching function of meaning-making.
Again, from a Kabbalistic perspective, because that is the perspective that I draw my insight regarding consciousness and other things, the Kabbalah indicates that everything is made of these 10 powers, 10 sephirot, which emanate from what's called the Ein Sof, the undifferentiated absolute unity of God. And he splits himself, in a sense, into these 10 powers, and different combinations of these powers give rise to the entire creation. And of everything created, every object and every event, the top three, whether it's Keter Chochmah Bina or Chochmah Bina Dat, the top three of the 10 are its consciousness. So a rock, like everything else, is made up of 10 sephirot. The top three inform form and substance to the rock. When you move up to the next level of plant life, then the top three sephirot inform growth and reproduction, which are denied to the inanimate class. When you move up further to animal life, the top three sephirot will then endow emotions, cognition, and finally, when you reach man, you have the expression of higher cognitive faculties, rationality, morality, ethics, etc. So that is how consciousness is defined Kabbalistically. And that's why it's panpsychist in its ontology, because everything is made up of 10 sephirot, and since the top three are conscious, therefore everything has some level of consciousness, which differs, of course, dramatically when you're ascending from rocks through plants to animals to human beings. That's the Kabbalistic definition of what consciousness is.
Say exactly as Mark did, that Thomas Nagel's idea that consciousness is there being something like what it is to be that creature, that is the consciousness, that is the existence of consciousness. But there's something else Nagel said that I think is rather good, perhaps as an overall comment to our conversation. Certain forms of perplexity, for example, about freedom, knowledge, and the meaning of life, seem to me to embody more insight than any of the supposed solutions to these problems. Which puts me in mind of Stuart Sutherland, who edited the Oxford Handbook of Consciousness, I think, saying that it's a perplexing and fascinating thing. Nobody has the slightest idea what it is, and nothing useful has ever been written about it. So I'm going to let myself off the hook there. On the question, though, is all that we experience, is there only subjectivity? Absolutely not. No, of course not. No, I mean, I absolutely will go to the stake for that there is something that is not just made up by my puny mind. So no, my mind is in contact, as I say, in an encounter with something other than itself, and out of that comes my experience. So that's all I'd like to say.
So any final thoughts?
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this conversation. Thanks to all three of you very much.
Second all of that. And I also say how very reassuring it is, Mark, to see you confess that sometimes you can't retain in your mind at the same time several points that you want to make. I find this all the time, and so it's marvelous that you are willing to say this.
And I'll third that and say this was a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to more such meetings in the near future.
Indeed.
Thank you, Ivy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
I hope you're all enjoying it. And then we will see you again soon sometime for another exploration. Thank you so much, guys.
Very, very good.
Yeah. Thank you for the invaluable time and insight. See you again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.